This is part 2 of my series on the houses. Your chart is a 360-degree circle divided into 12 equal parts called houses. The houses represent different areas of life, and in order to interpret these areas of life, you must first understand the first house. Here's your chart. Imagine that it is also a clock representing the stages of the sun in the sky. This is your rising sign or ascendant, they're the same thing. And this represents where the sun rises, where it's most visible, illuminated, exposed. It also represents birth. This is going to symbolize your self, body, and ego. As the sun moves up in the sky, it reaches a high point right here called the midheaven. This represents noontime, where activities are abundant, where we are working, where things are hot and busy, and then we are setting. And this is where the sun sets, on the descendant. The descendant represents endings and death, opposite the point of the ascendant, representing birth and beginnings. Because the ascendant represents self, the descendant is going to represent others and relationships. Now that it's dark, we're going to reach midnight, a point that is most dark in the chart. This dark point is also quite grounded, because if I were standing here in daytime and I were to drill a hole to the middle of the earth, on the opposite side, it's going to be very dark. So the nighttime portion of the chart is also synonymous with the ground we walk on. We already talked about houses 1 through 3 belonging to the nighttime eastern portion, representing the private self, in other words, personal development. Houses 4 through 6 are on the western portion, representing others, but because it's below the horizon line, it's still personal. Everything between houses 1 and 6 is foundational, developmental, in the soil, in the ground. Everything between houses 7 and 12 is in the sky with the clouds. The 4th house is on the cusp of midnight, or the imium coli, the darkest part of the chart. So the 4th house will have a deep and grounded quality. The 4th house represents our roots, our ancestors, our property and home, everything that is private and domestic. If the 1st house is the pretty flower, the 4th house is the root. There are multiple houses astrologers associate with death, and the 4th house is one of them, because midnight is a mystical, time-bending moment where the present becomes past. You can think of the 4th house as the area of homeostasis, representing our emotional well-being and home environment. Homeostasis produces a sense of safety and health, and the 4th house will measure that. If our homeostasis is disrupted, we will get sick. The 4th house squares the 1st house. In simple terms, a square is a 90-degree angle, and 90-degree angles in astrology signify something that is critical. Our 1st house represents our dignity and health of body, which heavily depends upon the conditions of the 4th house. If you look at the 4 points on the clock, rising, setting, noon, and midnight, they're all squaring each other. They're all 90 degrees apart. So the houses on the cusps of those 4 points are going to be very important. 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th. Let's move on to the 5th house. The 5th house makes a trine with the 1st house. Again, the 1st house, very important. A trine, in simple terms, is a 120-degree angle. And 120-degree angles are very peaceful, harmonious, and lovely. So the characteristics of the 5th house are going to be very light and joyful. The 5th house is going to represent things like children, intercourse, creative intelligence, and the arts. Another reason there's positive connotations for the 5th house is because Venus finds her joy here, and Venus is the planet of pleasure, desire. But just because you have a planet here does not mean you're going to get good results. If desires are strong, aversions could be strong. If desires are strong, we may be more prone to risk-taking, delusions, escapism. Desire could also be linked to shame. So a planet in the 5th house shows us our relationship to desire and pleasure, and doesn't necessarily indicate that we have a pleasurable or desirous life, or that our relationship to pleasure is a good one. And a more common association is that the 5th house can indicate talent and creativity. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the 6th house, just be warned, because it's very misunderstood. Okay, so again, 1st house, 6th house is right here. The 1st house and 6th house have an inconjunct relationship, and inconjunction is simply a 150-degree angle in astrology. This angle is associated with disharmony, disagreement, and discomfort. So the themes of the 6th house are going to make it very hard for the 1st house to achieve its goal of manifesting. The sixth house is the house of enemies, illness, labor, and hard work. The first house is the house of what's clear, bright, and lucid. And the seventh house, its polarity point, sunset, is the house of things that are ending, becoming dark. An ending is a death. Then the sixth house would be the root that creates conditions for endings, like illness. So if you have planets in the sixth house, are you going to be miserable? No. What is important to note here is because the sixth house is the house of illness, enemies, all of these things that need to be fought. If you have masculine planets like Mars, Saturn, or the Sun in the sixth house, this can produce really good results. In fact, Mars finds its joy here because Mars is a really good fighter and defeats its enemies. But even if we have a well-placed planet here, it can still make us prone to stress. The more negative results could come from having planets like Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter in the sixth house because these planets don't like to fight. These planets are pacifists, but being a pacifist may not be such a bad thing. You have to look at the condition of these planets. If they're in debility in the house of enemies, well, maybe that's not so good. If they're in debility in the house of illness, that's not so good. Having a planet like Venus or Mercury in the sixth house might mean that you're not so good at dealing with conflict. You may sacrifice your time or energy without the proper recognition. You may enter situations in which standing up for yourself is not a safe option. Mercury is the planet of friendship and finesse, does not like fighting. Venus is the planet of love and relationships, does not like fighting. Jupiter is the planet of laws. It's not going to break any rules, which you kind of have to fight someone, right? And it gets even more complicated because you may not even have any planets in the sixth house and you think you're off the hook. But you're not, because the Lord of your sixth house, meaning the planet that is connected to the sign that your sixth house is in, for example, if your sixth house is in Libra, look at Venus. If the Lord is up to some funny business in your chart, then guess what? You're going to have some negative sixth house influences. Okay, it's cold. Bye.